In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Jewish marriage customs featured a wedding feast, which could be a rather lengthy affair. Depending, of course, on the wealth or lack thereof of the couple themselves, they could last up to a week or even more. And in the course of it, there was a fair bit of eating and, obviously, quite a bit of drinking. And wine is kept in reserve for weddings, even to this day, and is kept in large amounts. And to run out of wine during the course of a wedding feast is not merely just an embarrassment. It is something which reflects directly on the wedding couple themselves. And if they run out, it does not bode well for the marriage itself. And so it was more than just a mere embarrassment that Mary noticed when she saw that they were running out of wine. And turning to her divine Son, she informs him, "They have no more wine." Christ's reply is something that can be easily misunderstood when he says, "Woman, what is that to me and to thee? My hour has not yet come." First of all, when he addressed her as woman, it was not in any way derogatory. In fact, at that time and place, it was the highest title of respect to address someone as woman. But then he says, "My hour has not yet come." One might ask, well, of course, the hour would be the hour of his betrayal, his passion, and his death. What, in the name of all that is holy, has that got to do with a wedding feast and relieving a shortage of wine? Well, it's really very simple. Because this would be the first of his miracles. It would be the first time that he would show to the world his true identity, that he is not just a Galilean or a good man, but he is God. He possesses power to work miracles. In so doing, he would attract the attention of those who would take issue with that. For men for whom, instead of love and reverence being excited, their jealousy and hatred would be enkindled. God is rather like the sun, whose light shines on both wax and mud. It's the same sunlight, but the reactions can be quite different. When it shines on wax, it softens it. When it shines on mud, it hardens it. When we encounter Christ, and we do so personally, there really can be no middle ground. It's either one or the other. We will be shown for what we really are, and we will either love him or we will hate him. It's rather interesting that in a recent meeting of the board of the Academy Awards to decide which film was going to receive the award for Best Picture of the year, when the subject of The Passion came up, the room was filled with blasphemies and cussing. Really. They were shown to be what they really are. And so Christ, in consenting to work this miracle and showing himself to the world, would actually be signing his own death warrant. The world cannot tolerate those who are very good and those who are very bad. The very bad because they disturb its material security. The very good because they disturb its conscience. And I venture to say that they can tolerate the very good with less ease than they can tolerate the bad. But at any rate, Christ would be crucified next to two thieves. You saw goodness incarnate and the very bad on Calvary together. He was making that very plain, that in working this miracle, he would be setting out on the road to Calvary. It's very important that he did this in a particular setting, in the celebration of a marriage. He's telling us that he thought this marriage in particular, and marriage in general, was worth dying for. Marriage is something that is created by God. He is the author of marriage. He is the one who writes the laws under which it is to be governed. Therefore, it is not something which we can reinvent according to our own personal tastes. It is not something whose definition in law can be adjusted to current fashion. We must accept it as it has been given by God, all of the current tendencies notwithstanding. Marriage has been made by God for the joining of one man and one woman, and He's made it so for the purpose of the procreation of children, and then secondly, the consolation of the spouses. This is what God has given us, and it is a great vocation. He's inviting us to take it up for those who are called to it as a means of sanctification. Now, there are quite a few contradictory misunderstandings about marriage, both of them quite extreme. Some think of marriage as not so much a big deal. You can get into it and out of it quite easily, depending upon your inclinations, so is thought. Or that marriage can be dispensed with altogether if you feel like just living together without the benefit of it. That's one error. The other extreme is that marriage is thought of as some kind of occupational therapy. It's the kind of an institution that you can check yourself into to relieve whatever psychopathology happens to be besieging you. Just take a look at some of the outfall of the recent priest scandals. The cry has gone up that celibacy should be done away with and that priests should marry. Really? So marriage is going to cure all that, is it? Must be pretty magical. Like any other sacrament, marriage is a channel through which grace flows, and grace is something which builds on nature. If there are good things in someone, some positive natural virtues in a man and a woman, then grace has something upon which to build and grow. But if a couple bring to marriage severe deficits, some tremendous moral failings, and grace can't do much for that. There has to be something given on our part, beginning with reverence for it. So that preparation for marriage is something that begins actually in childhood by the cultivation of virtue and the realization that marriage itself is a challenging vocation. It is something for men and women, not for boys and girls. Couples that come to the altar all starry-eyed, thinking they're just punching their ticket to get into an earthly heaven, worry me. Have they really stopped to think what they're in store for? Have they stopped to look at the challenges that their own parents have had to face over the years? Maybe not. But when a couple have looked at all this, and they have cultivated virtue, they are men and women of prayer and sacrifice, and have that spirit of seeking the benefit of the others, then a great deal is given to them. They can expect much. In fact, in the instruction which is read during the course of the marriage ceremony, it promises a rather startling thing. For those who approach marriage, abiding by God's law, availing of His grace, and with the clear intention and will to sacrifice themselves for the sake of each other and for their children, they can hope to know the greatest measure of earthly happiness that one can have in this vale of tears. St. Augustine, in writing on marriage, talked about the three goods of marriage. For all the sacrifices that a couple have to put into it, they can expect a great deal in return. The first of these three goods is the good of fidelity. That one man and one woman belong entirely to each other, and that they will be faithful to each other in a bond that endures until death. And in it, they will be confident that they can make mutual sacrifices. And that in times of hardship, which will come, they can have mutual support. That here is a mutually complementary relationship between a husband and a wife. The wife is the heart of the home. The husband is its head. They are equal in a certain sense, but this is a complementary. They complement each other. Now, these days, people are led to believe in a totally egalitarian point of view. That yes, they are equal completely across the board, and that the governing of a family is to be this wonderful joint effort in which everybody is democratically joyful. Well, it doesn't work. Somebody has to have the last word. Somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to shoulder the responsibility for the security and the provision of the family's needs. Saint Joseph was designated so by God. And when the order was given and he passed it on and he gave the order to his family, "Up, let us flee to Egypt," Mary could have said, "Well, pardon me, I'm the Immaculate Conceived Mother of God, and I didn't get any message telling me that we had to go to Egypt, so don't bother me with this. And besides, my divine Son hasn't said anything about it." Well, that didn't happen, of course. Joseph took up his charge, his duty as head of the family with humility and courage, realizing, of course, that the woman that he was to give commands to was quite on a higher plane than he was, and certainly so was his foster son, who was God incarnate. He was the head of that family, just as every father is the head of the family that God has given to him by God's decree. Now, the dethroning of the father as head of the family in our age is the result of a warped ideology. Nevertheless, an ideology which has not been short of seeming justifications, of men who have not carried out their duty as it should be, with humility and courage, remembering that authority is given by God for the sake of service to those over whom you have that authority, not for one's own aggrandizement. So when a man treats his wife and children as possessions to be abused at will, he's really undermining his own authority, and he isn't doing any other men any favors either. Authority is to be exercised the way Joseph did it, not for his own benefit, but for the support and the protection of those that have been entrusted to him. There's an interesting part in the book of Genesis where it talks about the creation of Eve. Now, one can glance over that and think, well, that's a nice little story, and completely miss the profound theological truth that is hidden there. God made Eve from the rib of Adam. And think about it for a moment. If I were to give you a choice, which would you choose? Would you like to be created out of the dust of the earth? Or would you prefer to be built up from someone made in the likeness and image of God? It gives you something of an idea of the dignity of woman. And she occupies the place as the heart of the home. But at any rate, Eve was created from a bone from Adam's side, not from his head that she should lord it over him, and not from his foot that he should dominate her, not from his back that she should follow behind him, not from his front that he should trail along behind her, but from a rib at his side where she belongs, near his heart to be loved by him, and under his arm to be protected by him. The second good that Augustine mentioned was the good of the sacrament. And in the conferral of this sacrament, when a man and a woman approach the altar and repeat their vows, God takes them at their word, and then he joins them two in one flesh. They are no longer two. They are one. We may not see it, but then there are many realities which our eyes cannot see, which are more real than anything we can. And marriage is one of those. God has joined the two in one flesh. He has brought the whole of his infinite power to bear on these two people. And what God has joined, man must not tear asunder, must not divide. This is something we have to be reminded of occasionally in this day and age when divorce and the mentality that it fosters is in the very air we breathe. A lot of folks are running around with the idea in their mind that divorce dissolves a marriage and renders one free to remarry, etc., etc., etc. Think about it for a minute, folks. What they're saying is that a judge sitting on a bench somewhere can affix a few little scrawls of ink to the bottom of a piece of paper, and that will have the power to dissolve something which has required all of God's power to create. Can you think of a better example of arrogance than that, and of sheer stupidity? A judge might just as well sign a piece of paper and declare that the continent of Australia does not exist. Nothing could be further from his power. God is the author of marriage. And for those who think that marriage is just a piece of paper, divorce, that's just a piece of paper. And it's going to be worth less than the paper it's printed on when one appears before the judgment seat of God. But the sacrament of holy matrimony brings about an unbreakable stability. And with that, believe it or not, great freedom. Because a couple can look at each other in absolute confidence. And there's freedom with it because that confidence is unshakable. That's not enjoyed by those who choose to live together without benefit of marriage. Those are relationships which are built to fall apart. And one will always be looking for that telltale sign that the jig is up. There was one couple once upon a time who were living outside of marriage, living in sin. And they always had this little ritual whereby they would eat their meal sitting right next to each other. But then one day the husband committed the unforgivable sin of sitting up across the table from her. She immediately interpreted this as the infallible sign that the relationship was over, dead, and done with. How preposterous. In marriage made by God, there are no such tripwires. People can live in confidence that this is a bond that will endure. The grace of the sacrament of holy matrimony joins two in one flesh. But it also gives them the grace to carry out the tasks that are incumbent with the married state. Like any other grace, it enlightens the intellect so that you will know what is good and true. And it strengthens the will so that you will be able to decide what is right and carry it through with perseverance, so that you will be a good husband and wife to each other, and a good husband and a good father and mother to your children. That's a big enough challenge, and you have God's grace to aid you. The string attached, of course, is that you have to keep that grace alive. If, for example, someone approaches the altar in a state of mortal sin and attempts marriage, is that marriage valid? Yes, it is. But they don't get the grace they need to carry out their duty. Which means that for all of us for those of you who are married, we need to keep the grace of the sacrament alive, which means regular confession, avoiding mortal sin. And if you find yourself in it, go to confession immediately. Because not only are you the loser for it, those under your authority will suffer. Because your judgment will be impaired and your will be weakened as a consequence. This is especially an obligation on fathers of families, of husbands. You are the head of the family. It is for you to pursue holiness above all others, because all others are dependent upon you. The marriage ceremony itself is an act of priesthood. Let me explain that. As a priest, I will do certain things which are acts of priesthood, like, for example, giving absolution. And in a few minutes, I will confect the Holy Eucharist and the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. But there is one sacrament I will never administer, and that's the sacrament of holy matrimony. It is the couple themselves who marry each other. They confer the sacrament on each other. When two people who are baptized approach the altar, they are exercising, probably the only time in their life, a priestly office. Now, it's important to remember that marriage is a public sacrament, and there have to be witnesses. Some witnesses are essential even for the validity of that marriage, even though the couple themselves are the one to confer it. The presence of a priest or a deacon is one of those necessary witnesses. Unless, of course, you've got a dispensation from a bishop for form. What this means is that for Catholics, if both parties are Catholic, or at least one is Catholic, that marriage has to be witnessed in a church by a delegated priest or deacon. If that does not happen, then that marriage is not valid, and they have no marriage rights coming out of it. This means that we as Catholics are forbidden to lend what we call forbidden assistance at marriages which we know to be valid. It's a different matter when you're talking about people who are Protestants or some other religion. Their marriages are recognized as valid by the church. But if a couple, or at least one of those, is Catholic, it must be in the church or it is not valid. When you go to a wedding, keep in mind that you are not just an idle spectator. You are a witness. And not unlike a witness who gives testimony in, say, a court of law, what you are doing by your presence there is testifying to the validity, to the truth of what is happening in front of you. And when that which is happening in front of you is not valid, then you are standing in witness to something which is akin to perjury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the rubber of our faith really meets the road. Because in this day and age, when marriage is looked upon in such irreverent ways, we may find ourselves invited to take part as witnesses to marriage which we will know to be invalid because at least one party is a Catholic and is not taking place in the Catholic Church in front of a priest or a deacon. And sometimes that might even occur within your own families. That's tough. There was a woman I know of once whose son had been married, divorced, and then he chose to attempt marriage again. It was a mere attempt at marriage. His first marriage was valid. And she was invited to come, and she warned him, I cannot. The pressure was on, but she stood up to it, and she stayed home and cried. She was vilified for what other people thought to be her lack of consideration and feeling. But what she did was right. She remained faithful to Christ and refused to stand in testimony over something she knew to be false. The third good that St. Augustine mentioned, and also which he insisted is the greatest good of marriage, is the good of children. Again, here is something which rubs modern ears kind of the wrong way. Because children today are not looked upon as the blessing that they once were. In biblical times, barrenness was regarded as a curse. And women would pray to be released from this shame by being allowed to conceive children. Today it's different. Because children, rather than being looked upon as a great gift from God, are rather looked upon as something of an inconvenience, something that crimps our personal style and limits our own selfish indulgences. We forget that God, in giving man and woman the gift of marriage, is inviting them to give him back citizens for heaven. Children are to be prized for what they are. They come to us from God. They are entrusted to us. And we are to give them back to God as citizens of heaven. They are the greatest gift, the crowning glory of marriage. If you have a couple who just spend their time gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, then sooner or later they will notice the warts. We all have them. None of us are immaculately conceived. But if instead of that they look out together at their children, oh sure, there will be problems. But those flaws will not become the thin end of the wedge which will drive them apart. The children will in fact be the mortar which bonds their marriage ever more securely together. So how do we look at children? Are they put down on the deficit side or the positive side of the ledger? There was a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, not exactly somebody who was living on the lap of luxury, mind you, but he lamented that those Americans must be very poor if they can only afford 2.3 children per marriage. How do we value children? There was a couple in England who had one child, a boy. And after a rather long and undesired delay, the woman was again found to be with child. And they were very excited about it, and so was the boy. He was delighted with the idea of having a brother or sister. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. The woman suffered a miscarriage, and it fell to the father to tell his son that he wouldn't have that brother or sister that he was hoping for. And bowing before the inscrutable will of God, he said, "It is better that way." Well, the little boy was not so easily bought off. And he retorted, but Daddy, what can be better than a baby? That's the kind of wisdom our computerized programs will never produce. It's the wisdom, that God gives us in the good of children, the greatest good of marriage. Marriage is something that has been instituted by God for the joining of one man and one woman in an unbreakable bond to be dissolved only by death. It's a wonderful sacrament through which grace flows. It is a means of sanctification. It is therefore holy ground upon which we ought not to tread, to be respectful of it, not to arrogate to ourselves the right of dissolution of it whenever we think it convenient, or of redefinition according to current fashion. But remember that it comes to us from the hand of God. And as was indicated in today's gospel, a hand that for the sake of marriage